Hello, welcome to another video podcast on neuroanatomy. In this video, we'll be talking about the sensory areas of the brain. We'll be talking about the primary sensory area, the secondary somesthetic area, or the secondary sensory area, and we'll be talking about the somesthetic association area. We'll talk a little bit about the inverted representation of the human body on the primary sensory area, which is known as sensory homunculus, and then we'll talk about the lesions by the strokes in the ACA and the MCA, the vessels which are supplying the cerebral cortex, and the sensory loss as a result of those lesions. Right, so let's start with some of the basic sulci. So let's start with the basic orientation of the prosections first. So what you can see over here, you're basically looking at the left lateral view of the cerebral cortex. You can see the left cerebral hemisphere, and we can see the frontal end of the brain over here. This is the posterior or the back end of the brain. That's the occipital lobe, and the posterior side is characterized by the cerebellum down below as well. There's an important sulcus which you will have to know for understanding the sensory areas, and that is the lateral sulcus. You can see it separates the temporal lobe down below from the frontal and parietal lobe at the top. We'll talk about central sulcus a bit later as well. This is the medial view of cerebral hemisphere. Once again, you can see the frontal lobe in the front, the cerebellum and the occipital lobe at the back. The medial view is characterized by this corpus callosum, the C-shaped white matter commissural fiber. Right, so now let's start with some of the important sulci which we have to know in order to be able to understand the location of primary sensory area. So let's start with the left lateral view of the cerebral hemisphere on the left side, and we can see a sulcus here which is called the central sulcus. You can see the central sulcus separates the frontal lobe in the front from the parietal lobe at the back. This central sulcus extends all the way to the top to the superior margin and then jumps onto the medial side where it can be seen going on to the medial side over here. The central sulcus is then clasped over here by the paracentral lobule, which is a gyrus that limits the central sulcus on the medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere. Now, on the lateral side, we can see another sulcus which is running parallel to the central sulcus at the back. This is the post-central sulcus. So the area which is in between the central sulcus and the post-central sulcus, that is the post-central gyrus. Let's just highlight this region over here, and we can see the region color-coded in green over here. This is the post-central gyrus containing primary sensory area on the supralateral side and then extending onto the medial side where it is forming the posterior part of paracentral lobule. This region is also known as the Brodmann's area 3, 1, and 2. Right, so what are the functions of the primary sensory area? Remember, this is the primary sensory area, so it's going to be just receiving the information, the sensory information firsthand. The general somatic sensation pertaining to touch, pain, temperature, vibration, proprioception, two-point discrimination, all those kinds of general somatic sensations, they're going to be entering into this region either from the lower body or from the head and neck region. But the brain is not going to be able to make sense out of that information. This primary sensory information is then going to be sent over to the higher order association areas where they're going to be, where the information is going to be processed, and we will start making sense out of that information. Okay, so now the primary sensory area of the cortex receives the sensory projections from two regions inside the thalamus. So basically, every sensory information has to first relay inside our thalamus, which is the sensory relay station. There's one exception though for that, which is the olfactory sensation, the sense of smell. Apart from that, every sensory information, doesn't matter if it's general or it is special, it has to relay inside the thalamus. The primary sensory area receives this sensory information from the thalamus, either from the ventral posterior lateral or the ventral posterior medial nucleus. Ventral posterior lateral is abbreviated as VPL, and the abbreviation VPM stands for the ventral posterior medial nucleus of the thalamus. The only difference is that the information from the face that is relayed inside the thalamus in the VPM nucleus, and then it gets projected onto the primary sensory area over here in the head and neck region, and the information from the rest of the body is relayed into the thalamus in the VPL nucleus, and that is then relayed to its respective body, the representation of the body part on the primary sensory area over here inside the post central gyrus. Right. Now, another thing which we can talk about in context of the functioning of the primary sensory area is the representation of our body parts on this region, which is known as the sensory homunculus. Right, for that, let's just jump over to this next slide over here, where you can actually see the primary sensory area color coded over here between the central sulcus and the post central sulcus on the left cerebral hemisphere. If we take a coronal section through it, remember coronal section is a side to side section, then we can see that section of the cerebral cortex. Here we can see the parietal lobe at the top, the lateral sulcus, and then the temporal lobe down below. See, our body is represented in an inverted fashion over here, with the head and neck region down below, followed by the hand, the fingers, and then come the arm and the trunk region, and then comes the lower part of the body. And you can see that the legs are kind of represented on the medial side over here. So this is an inverted representation of our body on the primary sensory area, and that is known as the sensory homunculus. Just to add over here, the anal and the genital regions are also found on the medial side in an area which is known as the paracentral lobule. And this is important to know, because now, based on this information, we can figure out that which sensory which part of the or in which part of the body the sensory information is going to be lost as a result of the impairment of that region of the brain, because of the uh, eh, because of the loss of vasculature in that region, for example, because of a stroke of the vessel, which is basically supplying that brain. So we'll talk about that with the help of a few case examples in a second. One more thing which I need to highlight before we go over to that is that if you look over here, see the pointing of the cortex for a particular part of the body is actually related to the functional importance of that region, rather than the size of that region. For instance, what I mean by that is, if you look over here, see the face, the lips, and the tongue, the thumb and the index finger, right? These have particularly large areas of representation on the sensory homunculus. So, in fact, the size of the the size of the cortical area, which is allocated to each part of the body, is actually directly proportional to the complexity of the sensory information, or in other words, to the number of sensory receptors present in that part of the body. And like on the contrary, you can see that the trunk and the thighs and the legs, they have a much smaller representation on the sensory homunculus. Right now, you can so, like, now let's talk a little bit about, in that context, let's just talk a little bit about the vasculature of the cerebral cortices, and see what kind of deficits can we actually have, or what kind of sensory losses can we have by strokes in different regions of the cortex. Now, so as far as the vasculature is concerned, there are two main arteries which you have to know about. One of them is the anterior cerebral artery, and the other is the middle cerebral artery. Right, so if you look over here, see the anterior cerebral artery basically supplies the medial region of the cortex, and about a centimeter long strip which is on the superolateral surface. So basically, the areas of the cortex which are supplied by the anterior cerebral artery, these are the areas where our lower body is going to be represented on the sensory homunculus. Right, on the contrary, the area which is on the major part of the superolateral surface, that where the hand and the upper limbs and the head and neck area are represented in the sensory homunculus, that area is supplied by the middle cerebral artery. Right, so as a result, how do we apply this information clinically? Well, if there is a stroke which is involving the anterior cerebral artery, then the patients usually are going to be presenting with sensory loss in the lower part of the body, in the lower limbs, for example, whereas the sensory loss in the upper limbs and in the head and neck region would be manifested if there is a stroke involving the middle cerebral artery. Let's just apply this information further into a clinical context. Let's say if a patient presents with sensory loss in the right arm, then that means that if you have to choose between the ACA and the MCA, between the anterior cerebral artery and the middle cerebral artery strokes, then a patient who presents with a right arm sensory loss would probably this would probably mean that the impaired since the sensory loss in the arm is impaired, then that probably means that the anterior cerebral artery is not involved, rather the middle cerebral artery has been involved. And since the body is represented in a contralateral fashion on the brain because of the decussation of the fibers, so that means that the MCA on the left side has been involved, right? Similarly, if you go to option D, if there's a person who presents with sensory loss in the leg region on the left side, then that means a vessel on the right side has been involved. Now, since the legs are showing the impairment of the sensory perception, then that means that the ACA is this time involved, MCA is spared. So that means, we've got an ACA, the anterior cerebral artery, on the right side, which is having the stroke or a clot in it. That's how we apply this information clinically. Now, although we're talking about the primary sensory area, the primary sensory area also has a role in in a motor control as well. For example, the anterior part of the post central gyrus, which is situated inside the central sulcus, that receives a large number of efferent fibers from the muscle spindles, tendon, organs, and joint receptors. This sensory information is then analyzed in the sensory cortex, and it is then passed forward beneath the central sulcus to the primary motor cortex right in front over here in the precentral gyrus, where it then greatly influences the control of skeletal muscle activity. So, this we've reiterated this point several times in the past as well, that the simple division of brain into different sensory and motor regions is kind of somewhat misleading. When we look at the functioning of the brain as a whole, we'll see that for any sensory or motor function, both the front and the back end of the brain are literally interconnected with each other, and they're working in a connected, coordinated fashion, and the whole brain is kind of involved in bringing about that activity. However, for sake of simplicity, we've divided these areas into purely sensory and motor regions. Right. Now let's jump over to another sensory region of the brain, which is known as the secondary sensory area, or the secondary somesthetic area. Now, the secondary somesthetic area is basically present inside the superior lip of the lateral sulcus. So this is the lateral sulcus, and this being the posterior ramus of the lateral sulcus. The superior lip of the lateral sulcus is formed by the parietal lobe. The inferior lip is formed by the temporal lobe. The secondary somesthetic area is in the superior lip of the posterior limb, or the posterior ramus of the lateral sulcus. The, the secondary sensory area is much smaller and kind of less important than the primary sensory area. Even in this region, we do observe some kind of a somatotopy. The representation of the body is here in a sequential fashion as well. We see the face is represented in the anterior part of secondary somesthetic area, while the leg area is represented in the posterior part over here. The detailed connection of this area are kind of unknown. Many sensory impulses come from the primary area. Many signals are transmitted from the brain stem to this region. However, the functional significance of this area is not clearly understood, though. Right. The However, like in the secondary somesthetic area is believed, however, to play an important role in pain perception, and the lesions may actually in this region may actually cause contralateral loss of pain, diesthesia, or pain asymbolia, which basically means that patient fails to display the aversive or the emotional responses to the pain, but can still discriminate between the pain intensity. So that's a little bit about the secondary somesthetic area. Now let's jump over to another area, which is the somesthetic association area, right? Now, where is the somesthetic association area present? Well, let me just highlight that region over here, right? So what you can see over here, that if you look at the parietal lobe, there's an important sulcus present over here, which is known as the intraparietal sulcus. We're on the superlateral surface, right? And we've got a sulcus here called the intraparietal sulcus, which separates the parietal lobe into a superior parietal lobule and an inferior parietal lobule. The somesthetic association area is present in the superior parietal lobule on the superior lateral surface and extends onto the medial surface over here as well. See, it's behind the paracentral lobule and in front of the parieto-occipital sulcus. This region belongs to the parietal lobe, and that is the somesthetic association area inside the superior parietal lobule. This region is also known as the Brodmann's area 5 and 7. This area has many connections with other sensory areas of the cortex, and it is believed that its main function is to receive and integrate the sensory modalities with each other. This is a higher order association area. For example, it enables one to recognize the objects placed in the hand without the help of vision, something which is known as stereognosis. In other words, it not only receives information concerning the size and the shape of an object, but also relates this to past sensory experiences. Thus, the information may be interpreted and recognition may occur, right? For example, a quarter placed in the hand can be distinguished from a dime or a nickel based on the information pertaining to the size and shape and feel of the coin without having to use one's eyes. Similarly, putting, let's say, commonly known objects into the hand, such as a pencil or keychains, right? These are recognizable by an individual with the eyes closed based on the proper functioning of this area. This is known as stereognosis. So, any destruction in the superior parietal lobule basically results in the loss of this ability to recognize these objects. So this is known as the astereognosis. So if there is a lesion in the primary inside the somesthetic association area in on the left side, which means on the dominant side, usually a common manifestation is astereognosis. On the contrary, if there is a lesion in the somesthetic association area on the right side, which is the non-dominant side, the right-sided lesions they can usually compromise body the body spatial awareness, which means the patients usually present with something which is known as a hemineglect syndrome, the awareness of the body in relationship to the spatial environment that gets impaired, and the usually the objects in the visual field on the left side, they are neglected, which is known as the hemi-neglect syndrome. And I'll just try to explain this by showing you this little diagram over here. See, this is basically a drawing of a house over here, right? And a person who has a stroke, let's say, involving the somesthetic association area in the superior parietal lobule on the right side. If he is asked to copy this picture over here, right? See, this is how the picture is being copied. So he can actually see the house on the right side, right? But he kind of neglects the part of the house in his left visual field. It's not that he can't see that house. If you draw his attention towards it, he will be able to see the house over here. He would, however, for some reason, his attention doesn't go over onto the left side, and he kind of neglects that part in his left visual field. This is known as a hemi-neglect syndrome, and there's a neglect in the left visual field because of a lesion in the superior parietal lobule on the right side. These are further two case examples where a person has hemi-neglect syndrome, and you can see that if he is basically asked to circle all the A's in the figure over here, then he can circle all the A's on the right side. but on the left side he kind of neglects this left visual field or anything which is in the left visual field, and therefore he doesn't circle all the A's over here. Similarly, if he's asked to cross all the lines over here, he starts crossing them on the right, but he kind of neglects the lines on the left side, which means he's neglecting his left visual field, which means there is a hemi-neglect syndrome due to a lesion in the right superior parietal lobule, in the right somesthetic association area. Right, so to summarize, in this video, we've talked about the primary sensory area, the secondary sensory area, and we've talked about the somesthetic association area, which is a higher order association area. We've talked about some clinical case examples, some clinical manifestations by lesions in these regions, and we've also talked about something which is known as the sensory homunculus.